On May 15th, 1967, a Soviet citizen, Boris Pereslavtsev, a member of the Soviet Institute of World Economy and International Relations, got arrested for drunkenly urinating out of a window of his apartment complex. This man, a member of the Soviet Communist Party, was subsequently called in 2 weeks later for a hearing from the Institute's Labor Committee, a Soviet version of HR, Human Relations. However, instead of chastising this particular individual for drunkenly urinating out a window, the committee criticized him for failing to report his transgression to the Labor Committee. The committee stated that, quote, "There is one thing which is significantly worse than your drunken actions. The fact that you did not tell the Institute about your transgressions, hoping we would not hear about it from the police, is significantly worse," unquote. The committee wanted to say that, quote, "The desire to hide something violates the behavior of proper communists. Why are you afraid of being judged by the party committee? Your fear of criticism and self-criticism is troubling. You must once again earn the trust of the party and the collective, comrade," unquote. The Institute's committee demoted this individual for, quote, "violating labor discipline and for immoral and uncommunist behavior." This case is fascinating for multiple reasons, right? It's interesting to know that even though this individual committed this transgression at home, he still got in trouble. It kind of suggests that a good communist is always working, right? A good communist is always on post, on duty, however you want to interpret it. But anyway, so the use of this language of morality and discipline and politeness reflects a direct use of language from Khrushchev's Moral Codex of the Builder of Communism, a set of rules adopted by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1961, which placed a general emphasis on socialist morality and useful collective labor. In the context of the Codex, this particular case reveals that Soviet citizens and political organizations utilized Stalinist language and Stalinist tools of discourse on a daily basis, especially like with a focus on like this language of morality and useful labor. So my PhD dissertation, and this is my prospectus, or part of my prospectus that I'm presenting today, Building Socialism from Within, will trace the relationship between the state's social engineering projects, such as the Moral Codex, and the internalization of perceived efficacy of socialist discourse across vastly different groups of Soviet citizens. Furthermore, former Soviet citizens and some post-Soviet republics continue to use socialist language and discourse on a daily basis, and I will talk about the sort of like nostalgia of that as well. So, just a little bit of background. By the time of Stalin's death, Stalinism was essentially the foundation of the Soviet political system. Thus, Khrushchev's attempt at de-Stalinization at the 20th Communist Party Congress in 1956 created a massive anxiety throughout the Soviet Union. As Soviet historian Polly Jones points out, the Communist Party under Khrushchev sought to legitimize Stalin without putting into question the legitimacy of the Communist Party and the Soviet state, especially because it was the party itself that committed Stalinist atrocities, right? So it's an interesting like tension that's happening there. So this paradoxical path created sort of anxious ambivalence towards the project of de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union during Khrushchev's thaw between 1956 and 1964. So as a response to the destabilizing effect of de-Stalinization, the 22nd Communist Party Congress in 1961 declared that one of the main bylaws of the Soviet state was the Moral Codex of the Builder of Communism, which I already mentioned, right? So yeah, you can read it up here, right? So it called for useful labor, an acute awareness of common duty, and tolerance towards transgressions of common interests, focused on communal and useful labor over individual accumulation, called for honest labor for the good of society. He who does not work does not eat, which is a direct quote from Marxist Capital, in case you're familiar with that. Finally called for individual morality, honesty and truthfulness, moral cleanliness, simplicity and modesty in public as well as private life. The Codex represented a way to continue the revolutionary struggle on an individual level at a time of apparent stability and peace, right? So after World War II is over, you kind of have like the stabilization of the Soviet state. So the question really is, how do you continue the revolutionary struggle when there's no more enemies? And so the Moral Codex kind of represented a way to like continue this revolutionary struggle through like a time of apparent stability, right? So this conservative language of morality seemed to have resonated with ordinary Soviet citizens. In a 1968 Ministry of Interior survey in the Soviet city of Taganrog, the survey asked, which discourses and problems are you most concerned with? And 68% of the individual surveyed stated they were interested in questions of public morality predominantly. So I think a good example of this is when in a group letter to local committee of local neighborhood council from May 10th of 1964 read that, this is an example of my research, that this person, the R redacted family, is fortunate to the apartment. They terrorize all the tenants. They're the ones who make scenes and start fights, and they're the ones who write slandered denunciations to different organizations, unquote. The authors, 4 Soviet communal apartment residents in Leningrad, were determined to denounce one of their neighbors for immoral behavior. The same group, however, also defended another communal apartment resident from a false denunciation. In the same letter, the residents wrote, quote, that in the apartment BI, name was also redacted, behaves modestly, normally, politely, and all tenants respect her a lot. We are sending you this declaration in case you received a slanderous declaration from Miss R.A. So this is the other person, right? So you can see this sort of like use of morality in like public life on like a daily basis in the context of housing, especially. So during like the Khrushchev period, Soviet citizens continued to denounce one another in much the same way that they did during the Stalin period. Letters from concerned residents to local residents' committees reflect the use of language of modesty and politeness from Khrushchev's codex. So the continued use of denunciations during this time period suggests Soviet citizens did not understand Khrushchev's thought and de-Stalinization as a distinctly liberal period. By 1964, 11 years after Stalin's death, Soviet citizens continued to utilize Stalinist language and tools to interact with the Soviet state, right? So consequently, my dissertation challenges the notion that Soviet Union lived in a late socialist or advanced socialist period, which was completely free of like Stalinist discourse and was completely de-Stalinized. Right, so this was not like a completely separate period in Soviet history, and I think it's kind of wrong to see it as a radical break from the Stalin period as historians have portrayed it in the past. So in fact, I mean, for ordinary citizens, the Thaw was a conservative period, many of whom looked fondly back on the Stalin years and who viewed Khrushchev as like a betrayer of Stalinist ideology, right? There was a lot of mobility in the Soviet Union. People were very grateful to Stalin, so the sort of denunciation of Stalin created a lot of resentment towards Khrushchev and the Communist Party. So this is not like necessarily a period of liberalization, as I already stated, right? So furthermore, my research attempts to provide a better understanding of contemporary nostalgia for the Soviet Union by looking at these continuities between the so-called periods of late or advanced socialism and the modern day. A better understanding of socialism, of late socialism, is essential in order to understand the Vladimir Putin presidency, Soviet nostalgia, and the failure of liberal democracy in contemporary Russia. For example, in a survey from January 2005, 51% of Russians reported they perceived the Soviet period as more positive than negative for the country. According to political scientist Edwin Bacon, the fundamental fact is to be drawn from these surveys is that the Russian people as a whole view the Soviet period as something of a golden era rather than an era of terror and oppression. So this is important to keep in mind. So this kind of sets the historical context for nostalgia. Furthermore, Khrushchev's historical ambivalence over the legacy of Stalinism and Stalinist past is endemic in Soviet and post-Soviet society. In the recent speech, this is actually like 2 weeks ago, to pro-Kremlin activists in the Russian city of Stavropol, the Russian president Vladimir Putin praised Joseph Stalin and his organizational structure of the Soviet Union. Additionally, the Russian government mobilized the Stalinist imagery from the Second World War in order to galvanize support for Russian military interventions in states like Georgia and Ukraine. The Kremlin utilized the Soviet imagery abroad in order to create pro-Russian sentiment in former Soviet republics. And the Russian state's reluctance to condemn Stalin and to shake off the Soviet past shows that this anxiety surrounding Stalin's legacy is still present in Russia today. The hesitancy to condemn Stalin's crimes on the part of the Russian state, while simultaneously preserving the legitimacy of the Kremlin and the Soviet past, are eerily similar to the anxieties facing the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1956. So you kind of can see the historical parallels, historical continuities that are happening between de-Stalinization in 56 and de-Stalinization now. So overall, my research seeks to understand why does such a large proportion of Soviet citizens actively support the Soviet state during its existence? And could a better understanding of this phenomenon help to explain why so many have continued to support the Russian Federation and other Soviet successor states even after the collapse? Many former Soviet citizens support Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that the expected transition to democracy has not taken place in Russia. So I'll try to kind of explain this continuity. So in order to answer these aforementioned questions, my dissertation primarily looked at Soviet history through the lens of housing. Housing represented one of many ways for the regime to penetrate the daily life of Soviet citizens and institute proper modes of behavior. This notion is hardly surprising, since before 1960, most Soviet citizens did not have a house or even a room to themselves. In Moscow in 1930, the average living space was 5.5 square meters per capita nationwide, dropping down to just 4 feet in 1940. So people lived in very cramped quarters. Like this little corner here would be like my corner. Like And that's like all the housing I had. So although between 1953 and 1970, roughly 140 million Soviet citizens acquired private apartments, which is like I think 75% of the Soviet population. The state continued to utilize neighborhood councils and interpersonal relationships to enforce proper forms of behavior, as you can kind of see with the example of the denunciation that I talked about. So obviously in the Soviet Union, housing was much more than a roof over someone's head. It was a very deeply politicized project, and the space was deeply politicized. These are just some pictures of like these sort of new housing constructions from 1965. You can see that these houses were very like mass produced. They all looked very similar to one another. But so anyway, so although just as I mentioned, this was a politicized space. So although the USSR was by no means a democratic society, during Communist Party elections, local party leaders attached their leaflets with their portraits and ideological positions to entrances and walls of apartment buildings. Images of Soviet leaders and party newspaper clippings were plastered in elevators and stairways of many apartment complexes. Soviet apartment residents literally could not leave or enter their apartment without coming into contact with agitprop or agitation and propaganda posters and official discourse on a daily basis. And I think the fact that Soviet leaders advertised themselves in apartment complexes also suggests that they thought people would actually read these. I mean, this is like a really good way to reach people on like a daily basis. So these quote socialist communities unquote created public spaces which shaped the daily life interactions of Soviet citizens with each other and the state. Within the microdistricts, so this is an example of the Soviet microdistrict. You can see how everything looks almost exactly the same. Soviet apartment blocks were built in squares with communal spaces in the middle. So you can see there's like in this picture, for example, like they're built in like squares or circular formations. And there's like a public space in the middle where people would like hang out and conjugate, right? So Soviet citizens, a lot of times the Soviet citizens appropriated these public spaces for their own benefit. For example, Soviet citizens attached personal and semi-personal listings advertising apartments for rent, the sale of couches and bookshelves, guitar lessons, and even open invitations for celebrations such as birthday parties and marriages. Apartment residents also posted listings for membership in neighborhood improvement committees, Marxist-Leninist reading groups, and even featured public denunciations of neighbors. So you can imagine you'd be like walking into your elevator and there'd be like a denunciation posted to a wall of like your local neighbor for like behaving immodestly or immorally. So this Soviet version of what I call proto-Craigslist suggests that Soviet residents utilized and appropriated public spaces for their own benefit as well as for ideological and political purposes. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any photos of this phenomenon. I've tried very hard to. So as I already said, kind of mentioned, architectural and spatial orientation of the apartment complex created a social space in which citizens fostered their own communities and political organizations. A typical microdistrict, which is what this is, or Microrayon in Russian, covered an area of about 30 to 160 acres and comprised of residential dwellings and public service buildings such as shops and schools. Microdistricts were separated by major roads and natural obstacles, which separated cities into smaller districts. The microdistricts were structured such as all microdistrict residents attended the same schools, shopped at the same shops, and even attended the same spots of leisure such as coffee shops and movie theaters. Standards mandated that all public services such as schools and stores were at most 500 meters away from any residential building during like the time of construction. So this is like kind of like a mini community kind of consciously created by the Soviet state. Since housing is so central to understanding the lived Soviet experience, I will study Soviet housing across the entire former Soviet Union in Moscow, as well as cities like Almaty and Kazakhstan, Tashkent. Due to massive industrialization drive during the first 5-year plan and post-war urbanization, Soviet citizens became Sovietized through the use of housing. As millions of Soviet rural residents moved to the cities during the Stalin and Khrushchev periods, the Soviet microdistrict started to epitomize the landscape of the Soviet city. Cities across the entire former Soviet Union, such as Moscow, Almaty, Tashkent, were transformed in order to look identical and distinctly Soviet. So, for example, this is in Estonia. This one is in Nikolaev, Russia. This one is in Moscow. This one is in Leningrad. So I mean, you can see how like all these cities were made to look exactly the same. Like there was a very distinctly Soviet architecture and like urban planning that the Soviets used across the entire former Soviet Union. these areas were actually so similar that a 1971 Soviet film called Irony of Faith satirizes this phenomenon. So this man who, on a New Year's night, he gets drunk in Moscow, and he wakes up a couple hours later in Leningrad, and he can't tell the difference between the two cities because they look exactly the same. All the apartment, like the physical apartment orientation and every building were so identical that he literally could not tell the difference. And so this is obviously like a very tongue-in-cheek sort of like satire of this, but I think it would have very much resonated with people who lived in Soviet cities. There's this is all very deliberate. So consequently, Soviet housing is central to understanding post-socialist spaces and post-socialist identities in the former Soviet Union after 1991. While many anthropologists, political scientists, and historians explore the public memory of Soviet monuments such as statues and memorials, I explore public memory of Soviet monuments. I assert the Soviet housing represented the sort of like ultimate memorial, ultimate remnant of Soviet history. Unlike many former monuments, such as this Lenin statue, which were taken down after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a large proportion of former Soviet citizens continue to live in Soviet-built housing. So, although former Soviet citizens now live in 15 different republics, they continue to use housing the same way they did in the Soviet period. So there's sort of like use of like advertising, like denunciations, like it still happens in like the post-Soviet day today. The microregions still exist. The public advertisements on the sides of houses and apartments continue to litter the urban landscape in the post-socialist apartment block. In this light, it's important to rethink Soviet apartment complexes as mere remnants of Soviet collapse. Instead, I show that these microdistricts are contemporary manifestation of the Soviet present in the post-socialist period. So this is like a somewhat fascinating continuity with the socialist past, and the housing kind of transcends the Soviet collapse as we think of it across the entire former Soviet Union. I mean, I think this image is very indicative. You can see like the square organization of the microdistrict with like everybody could see what everybody was doing all the time. I think, especially this, talk about panopticon, right? You can literally see all the way across what everyone else was doing. But sort of like just children playing on sickle and hammers in like the playground every day. It's a little bit bizarre, but I think overall housing, like looking at housing, complicates the notion that the Soviet Union fully collapsed in 1991, and that all former Soviet republics have distanced themselves from the Soviet past. The fact that many former Soviet residents live in Soviet-built housing makes it impossible to merely forget or take down these relics of the Soviet past the way you do with like Lenin and Stalin monuments. Housing epitomizes the contemporary post-socialist anxiety and tension across the former Soviet Union between forgetting and accepting the Soviet past, right? So in this sense, like the ambivalence surrounding post-socialist present is very similar to anxiety around de-Stalinization during the 1950s and 60s in the Soviet Union during the thaw. Furthermore, the fact that former Soviet citizens continue to use the same models of communication in the public space, such as the Soviet Union and Soviet urban planning, created a uniquely Soviet way of life. By using housing as the primary lens of my research, methodologically, I want to expand the historical archive and include physical manifestations of post-socialist space. And this is something I'm struggling with still, but instead of merely looking at archival documents, I want to look at architectural articulations of socialist space, like things like blueprints, apartment layouts, and even like contemporary advertisements, and looking at like stairwells and entrances even. So I hope, and by doing this, I hope to understand better how spatial and material conditions of Soviet citizens shaped their lived experience during and after socialism. By rethinking the archive as something more than simply paper documents, I hope to obtain a more accurate reflection of like daily lived experience of Soviet citizens. Anyways, the historical ambivalence and anxiety surrounding Stalin's legacy memories of socialism continue to permeate post-Soviet society today. So these are all pictures from 2015. So this is all very contemporary. So as you can see, like this sort of like socialist art on the side of Soviet buildings continues to exist, and in the way like you take down statues, as I already mentioned, you can't really take this down because these artistic images are really ingrained into these buildings. So like this sort of like really like socialist realist imagery, like depiction of workers on the sides of like apartment complexes and buildings. This this is very ubiquitous across the entire socialist bloc. You can see this in the GDR, you can see it in like Poland, you can see it in Kazakhstan, you can see it in Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, you name it. So the sort of like the housing project and like sort of like art that comes with it was very much like the two are very symbiotic and conjoined, right? As I already mentioned, there's a lot of examples of this, like depictions of workers, anything you can really think of. So yeah. And the sort of like ambivalence around de-Stalinization continues today. So, according to the Levada Center, Russia's biggest polling agency, the public respect for Stalin is on the rise. According to a 2015 survey, I'm going to go to this picture first. According to the 2015 survey from November, so a survey from a couple of months ago, 45% of Russians now believe that Stalin's repressions were at least to some extent justified. Interestingly, 2 years ago, the figure stood at 20%. So over a period of 2 years, public support of Stalin has more than doubled. The fact that Stalin's fluctuating popularity is on the rise suggests that Russia is still undergoing de-Stalinization, and the anxiety regarding Stalin's memory permeates public and private discourse. The survey suggests that Russia is still undergoing de-Stalinization, attempting to understand the Soviet past to this day. So, you know, this is a really interesting continuity that's still happening from this Khrushchev thaw period to like the modern day. So another example of this is in Kazakhstan. Where recently an indigenous Kazakh village named Eski Khan raised funds to reinstate a statue in the center of their town of Stalin. A local villager stated that we fought the Nazis' battle cry for the homeland for Stalin, and they wanted to pull down the statue over our dead bodies, we said. We stood firm and won. The anecdote kind of epitomizes the oscillation between the condemnation and praise of Stalin and the former Soviet Union. This ambivalence around de-Stalinization, is like present throughout the entire former Soviet Union. You can see this in Ukraine today with like people like protecting Lenin statues from being taken down. This is a phenomenon that's former Soviet Union wide, right? So, when we talk about Fukuyama's thesis on the end of history, I think you really have to rethink that, considering that history and the sort of like Soviet collapse is still happening like on a daily basis in the post-Soviet bloc today and the post-socialist bloc, right? So, in conclusion, the popular historical memory of the Soviet Union permeates the daily lives of public spaces of former Soviet citizens across the entire former USSR. The anxiety around de-Stalinization, started with Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, continues to shape political opinions and memories of many citizens of the former Soviet states. Yeah.